Hello, welcome back to another episode of Science and Soul. And today I definitely have soul on the episode because I have an incredible guest called Professor Soul Smith. And he is the author of The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery, a book I've been delving into. But more importantly, I actually was looking into his work for quite some time along my own neurodivergence journey. And Soul is the manager of the Neurospicy community as well, which I'm also in, and it's the largest support network for autistics, ADHDers, let's say even the what do you call them, the ADHDers too, like the combined neurodivergence in this world. And he's a certified autism specialist who is autistic, dyslexic, and living with ADHD. He spent more than 2 decades as a college professor before shifting his professional focus to coaching other autistics and other ADHD people just to gain autonomy in their own lives and find their sense of self. So, Soul himself is speaking into different types of avenues and aspects where he's reached hundreds and thousands of people on TikTok. And it's actually led him to go through educational seminars and different conversations and spark different perspectives around what it means to live with neurodivergence. And apart from maybe the more dogmatic or traditional approach and lens of what we know or may have been taught to see autism as, this is actually bringing more insight, more knowledge, more perspective and education around neurodiversity with different corporations, with just different human beings. I'm all about the hues of humanness. How can we accept, how can we love, how can we learn and gain curiosity about the hues of our humanness? Because I really believe that curiosity is the biggest love language. So he lives in Southern California. He's joining us today on this episode. He's a beautiful father of 4 children, a husband, and he has many different social links, which we will get to later on. But for now, I want to welcome Soul Smith. Thank you so much, Professor Soul, for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
I'm super excited too. Before we hit record, we were just saying how amazingly synchronized our outfits have matched in our backgrounds today. And I was like, it's so funny. I was going to wear a green jacket, like a green jumper. And then I was like, nope, it has to be brown. And then he's like, that was exactly the same for me, right? That was crazy.
It's true. Again, I took my green shirt's like literally sitting right over there. I took it off and went, yeah, we'll do orange. Yeah, it's wild.
Wild.
Yeah, we're halfway across the world from each other too. So crazy.
We can get to how telepathy and certain conversations in silence happen between autistics, right?
That's right.
So, I want today's conversation is going to, of course, bring the statistics, bring certain information that we're going to delve into about autism, autistic individuals, but also it's going to bring our own personal raw truth in here, because I would really love people to understand the depth of our lives and how it's shown up in our lives. Could you run me back to a little bit of how did you become a professor? And can you just take us a little bit on the journey into your neurodivergence discovery?
Sure. I mean, I was always attracted to the idea of being a teacher and a writer. It just kind of seemed I loved getting really into things, like into the weeds of things and into the connections of things. And I think that was kind of really the first sorts of clues of how I thought differently than most of the people around me. Was I was very, very into trying to figure out the full context and full connections of things. And it seemed like all of my classes that I was taking weren't very concerned in that. It was very much like, well, this won't be on the test, so don't worry about it. And I was like, I'm not worried about the test, so I just always kind of saw a sort of different take on things. So I was a professor since I was 22, was teaching college. And again, I just always knew that I thought differently and definitely ran into a lot of the stereotypical issues that autistics have in communication and relationships and in the workplace, but just never, ever tracked this as autism because the description just doesn't fit from the inside. We talk about the DSM, and the DSM seems to be written very much from the point of view of this is the way this person can be an inconvenience to you, and that's not really what we see. So it just didn't really speak to me. So I started getting really interested in, I was mainly writing and education professor. And when I got to little older, I got very interested in psychology, started reading a lot of psychology books, finally decided to do a degree in psychology, got very invested in autism and ADHD. And I just saw more and more and more of myself in there. And I was like, I don't know when I'm going to start telling people this, but I think that I think I'm autistic. I didn't see the ADHD for a very long time, but the autism was just kept coming up. And finally, I did seek a diagnosis, which, for the record, I don't think is absolutely necessary for other people or for anybody when it comes down to it. But I think that self-education is all you need. But anyway, so I did get a diagnosis at age I started suspecting at age 38, and I got a diagnosis at age 42. And along with that diagnosis came the ADHD diagnosis, which really took me by surprise. And gosh, ever since then, the ADHD has really been obvious to me. And I've wondered, is it because I just had my eyes closed to it, or is it because I've gotten older and my working memory has declined? I don't know what it is, but definitely it's strange to me that I questioned the ADHD for so long. So I'd been life coaching former students on and off over the years. It felt to me like the most effective kinds of teaching were the ones that happened one-on-one, the things that happened that were not connected to, necessarily course material, but to the things that somebody wanted to know and wanted to live. And that's where the life coaching really kind of came from, was how to change how to change your life and incorporate the things that you can learn into that. And once I realized I was autistic, I realized, wow, most of my coaching clients who would be former students who came back to me and were like, okay, the work world isn't what I thought it was. I think I need extra help. And I'd say, okay, well, let's talk about that. And eventually would turn into a coaching relationship. And then word of mouth would get around and I'd have a few clients here and there. And I realized that I think pretty much all of my clients were probably autistic as well. And that sort of lit a fire under me that this is a population that really doesn't have a lot of help. This is a population that when you're an adult and you recognize that you're autistic and you recognize all these problems you've had, I mean, I got a diagnosis and it was kind of like, here it is. And that was it. There's not anything else to go along with it. Like in the diagnosis, it said, suggestion to have cognitive behavioral therapy to help with communication problems. And I mean, all of my research had shown me that cognitive behavioral therapy didn't do very well for autism. So I was like, man, they're really leaving us stranded here. And I decided that I could take what I had been learning, what I'd been obsessing over, and try and help other people. But, one of my little sort of catchphrases is, let me obsess about autism so you don't have to. And I just really kept that deep dive going. I really tried to keep up with the research, keep studying, and I've just been very lucky to be in this space and be able to basically, since I've always been interested in the learning and thinking aspects of myself, I had a different language for the experience of autism than all of the pathological language that is given to us. So I feel like I do have a certain talent for being able to articulate our experience a little bit better. And that's kind of what's speaking to people over social media. And that's what sort of bridges this gap when I do coaching or even sometimes coach couples and stuff, is that I'm able to sort of bridge this gap of understanding because I've developed a sort of language for it. And it's not always smooth, it's not always easy, but it's been a really wonderful journey. It's been, finally finding work that really aligns with who I am and really gives back to people who are a lot like me and who I really care about.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's crazy how long we can go moving from certain unalignment. And I know that studies now estimate that up to 70% of autistic individuals actually have no intellectual disability, but many are navigating life, without realizing that they actually have the autistic traits. I mean, I was always I never considered it. I just always thought something was wrong with me. And so I
Yeah.
kept pushing harder to fit in and to try harder. And it no wonder I developed autoimmune issues and all of these different kinds of symptoms, in the body. But you also mentioned something in relation to, like, first of all, you started looking into it at around 38, right? Like, as in where you really questioned it within yourself. So how was life before that? Were you struggling?
Yeah, it's frustrating because there are just certain things that felt out of line, felt out of whack. I used to say, I can't imagine why I have to work so hard just to tread water. I loved teaching and I seemed to do very well with teaching, but I didn't seem to do very well with colleagues and with the administration. And it was just always, I felt like I was missing something. I would get on the wrong side of people and not really understand why, or say the wrong thing and not understand why it was wrong. Just, it always felt like people who started at the same time as I did were, within 4 or 5 years tenured. And here, 10 years later, I was still looking for a college to call home. I was jumping around a lot and feeling, kind of pushed out of the nest over and over again. Like, well, this just wasn't the right place. Well, this just wasn't the right place. Over and over again, and just thinking like, am I doing something wrong? Because it didn't feel like it. And everything that I had learned in my, doctorate work for education said that I was doing everything right. But that's the thing, is that the neurotypical world says one thing and does something differently. And they don't explain that to you. You're supposed to pick that up. You're supposed to socialize into that understanding. So it's very frustrating. It just felt very much like I was, sort of playing with the wrong controller. Like you said, like you felt like there's something wrong with you and you just have to try harder. And meanwhile, we kind of look out at some people, and I don't mean to, everybody has their challenges, but I look out at some people who just seem to be able to take it easy through their jobs, and it doesn't seem to be so wearing on them, and they don't have all of those human conflicts all day. And it just, something felt off. And I guess I keep coming up with video game metaphors lately, but it's like if you were playing a video game and you got up against some sort of challenge and you knew that there was something wrong and you kept trying harder and harder, but it's just that one of the buttons wasn't working, but you weren't tracking that. So you kept trying harder on the other buttons. And then somebody was like, oh, no, this button's supposed to work. I mean, you're just missing something. When you aren't aware that you're missing it, it's so hard to know that it's not there, if that makes sense. And so, there was just definitely always felt like there was something a little bit off and something a little bit out of alignment, that I was just kind of missing something. And yet, I was a very articulate person and I came across as confident, especially in, roles where I'm speaking or something. So it never seemed like there was something deficient about me as a person. And yet there would just still be these missteps. And it's because contexts change. And there's all this whole issue of social hierarchies and workplace hierarchies and stuff that I was just completely unaware of, really, at least on an instinctive level. And so it was very frustrating and really, really hard to just reconcile this idea of how much harder do I have to work? How much harder do I have to work to finally feel like I can be comfortable somewhere?
This sense of belonging, right? And
yeah,
I know that research highlights around, autistic and non-autistic misattunement. It's called the double empathy. Double empathy.
Yeah, the double empathy problem. Yeah.
So does that relate to what you're saying, really? That this kind of...
Yeah, definitely. The double empathy problem is essentially that there's a style of communication that neurotypicals are using and a style that autistics tend to use, and that we misunderstand each other while thinking that we are understanding, which is a little bit different than, say, if we were speaking two different languages and I know I don't understand what you're saying. And the problem is that for all these years, when we talk about there being a communication issue with autistics, most of the popular understanding and most of what's written about it is about the deficiencies that autistics have in communication. But when they've done research about autistic to autistic communication, they are just as good at trading information as two neurotypicals are. There finally became this sort of understanding that the burden shouldn't just be on the autistic person to try and match the conversational style of the non-autistic. Basically, autistics use words in a much more literal way. We use words as the meanings are assigned to them most of the time. And neurotypicals have a sense of meaning in what they say that is not necessarily ascribed to what they're saying. So what I mean is they tend to send a lot more meta messages. They want somebody to understand what they want without having to say it. They want to communicate something without having to directly address it. And this is just a cultural difference, and when you grow up and have all of your mirror neurons and synapses match each other, you socialize into this understanding, and you understand how people are communicating on these different sort of subtle levels, communicating in between the lines. And autistics tend not to do that. So we get very literal, and many of us tend to develop very complex vocabularies, trying to be more and more clear with what we're saying. And yet that doesn't really come across. And it's because there's really all of these different shades of meaning happening within neurotypical communication that are escaping us. And it's just, we just don't have the instinct for it. It's kind of like being colorblind, but for social meaning. And a great example is small talk. Like, small talk feels very, very pointless to an autistic person because we think of talking as we're exchanging information. But small talk for a neurotypical person is a way to sort of like vibe somebody out and see if you get along with them. So you talk about things that have no risk to them, just immediate observations about the world around you, the weather, the day of the week, the traffic. And so nobody's being vulnerable at all. But if the back and forth feels comfortable, then slowly people will begin to share more and more details about each other and become more and more vulnerable to each other. And this just isn't how autistics tend to think. We tend to either want to exchange information with somebody or not. And so it feels very tedious and pointless to talk about like how much we hate Mondays or whatever. And that's just that sort of dance of give and take and getting deeper is a way that they tend to develop friendships, and a way that they tend to sort of create a relationship just by getting into the same rhythm. And when you're not detecting those subtle nuances, it's hard to do that. And we don't. And this is part of the reason why we have a hard time really bonding with neurotypicals right off the bat, because we don't engage in that little social dance. And it makes us feel uncomfortable, and it makes them feel uncomfortable, and nobody can really put their finger on why. So yeah, just little things like that just make it really difficult, and it's hard to articulate. And then the way that it's in the DSM is, communicates literally. And the way that I understood that in the DSM growing up was, oh, well, that must mean that they don't understand metaphors. They don't understand, similes or, representative language. But that's not it at all. It's this idea that communicating literally means that they mean what they say, and not that they suggest meaning. That tracking at all? It's very weird. Yeah, it's very weird because basically, a neurotypical might, like, for example, I one of my favorite examples is like my boss might tell me, I really don't like the way that she's teaching that class in your department. And I'll say, yeah, no, I don't either. That's not how I would do it either. And she goes, okay, well, I'm glad we agree about that. And then a week later, my boss might say, okay, so did you talk to her about how she's teaching that class? Did you fix that? And I'll say, no. And she'll say, but I literally told you to fix that. And I'll say, no, you didn't.
You didn't.
You told me you didn't like it, and I agreed with you. But she feels as if she gave an order to go fix this, but didn't want to make it be an order, wanted to just sort of like see, are we on the same page about this? And suggest that since I am your boss, you now know that you should do something about it. So that feels like I've literally told you to do something. And to me, it just feels like, oh, we were having a discussion, because often we have discussions about things. Sometimes it might be about a student, or sometimes it might be about football. And this time it was about a teacher. And I just thought we agreed that we wouldn't teach it that way, but that's how she's teaching it. And we don't like that. So it's very hard to sort of tell that they're drawing from other sources to imbue meaning in what they're saying. Like, they're drawing from the hierarchy they're drawing from the context. And usually we're just sort of missing a lot of that. And we're looking at the words that we're using. And without the, okay, now go fix it, we don't see this as a literal communication.
What's so interesting though is like bringing the bottoms up perspective of like bottoms up processing. I feel like also the reason why I don't do small talk as well is the fact that I've already gathered a lot of information through my field and through the body, and there's so much information coming in, and I can read people's fields a lot. So it almost feels like there are just things I already feel like I know before I actually engage in conversation. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, things that you already know, so you don't need to. Yeah, you don't need to check the vibe.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
would you be able to explain for those who maybe don't know what the difference is between bottoms up processing versus top down?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and again, this is one of those tricky things that can be hard to sort of explain. But what it boils down to is that the brain uses a lot of energy to think, and it knows that with that being our primary resource as an animal, it is an abundance of energy when compared to other animals. So it tries to cut back, tries to create shortcuts, so it doesn't have to think about everything quite so deeply. So top-down thinking is the way that most people adapt to. And what this means is comparing what you're seeing and what you're knowing to something that you already know. Basically generalizing a lot of concepts and a lot of ideas and assuming knowledge based on those generalizations of previous experience. Where a autistic tends to build a picture from the details, tends to see all of the little parts before they decide on what they're looking at. Just for example, one of the biggest examples people use is a restaurant. That if a neurotypical person is in a restaurant, they know they're in a restaurant. So there's a lot of expectations here. They're going to be sitting at a table, there's going to be silverware, and there's going to be noise, smells, etc. And for an autistic person sitting in a restaurant, there's a lot of differences from restaurant to restaurant. And there's a lot of different ways to orient how things are run and what the sounds are like and what the smells are like. And so all of this stuff is a lot of information that you're processing that you don't stop processing because you're not filtering it out with this, like, it's okay, we're safe, we're in a restaurant. Instead, it's like, constantly trying to get a sort of like feel for the context of where you are. So this is part of why, autistics like to have a predictable routine, predictable places, because it cuts back on the amount of processing. So one of my favorite examples of this is a lesson I used to teach about media literacy. And I used to teach this lesson about advertising. And I was trying to teach them how advertisers communicate a message. And so we would look at print advertising, and I would say, okay, so I want you to look at 3 levels of meaning here. I'd say, number 1, what do you literally see in the picture? And I'd say, so number 2 is, what is the message that is being sent by this picture? And number 3, what is the cultural stereotype being used to communicate that message? Because they want to be very efficient. They want to make this message come across without you having to think about it. So I would put a advertisement up on the board, and I'd say, okay, so let's look at level 1. What do you literally see in this picture? And most students in the class would say, Coca-Cola is delicious and refreshing. And I'd say, no. That's the words, but what do you see in the picture? And they'd say, Coke makes you happy. And I'd say, no. What do you literally see? And they'd say, happy people like Coke. And I'd be like, no, that's the message. What do you see? And I'd finally have to say, no, you're seeing a person in a bikini, smiling, holding a bottle of Coke. And they go, and it's like those details, like clearly they're seeing that, but their brain doesn't want to dwell on that. It jumps to the message so that it's not having to process all of that. And it's just an automatic thing for top-down processors, is that it sees the message instead of all of the parts. And of course, this is all a spectrum. There's different levels of this. But just the fact that they draw meaning out of everything so quickly is it's very difficult for us, because this will happen in conversations too, where we might say something like, I felt like it was very hard for me when you said XYZ last week. And they might go, I'm sorry you think I'm such an asshole. And we go, no. I just thought that was uncomfortable for me. And, maybe if we could just avoid that topic. And they go, well, I'm sorry that you think I'm insensitive. And I go, no. I thought we just made a mistake. But it's like but for them, they usually would just say, I thought you were really insensitive last week. something like that, and wouldn't get into those weeds quite so much, because when they get very specific, it feels like you're nitpicking. It feels like you're picking them apart and really criticizing them, and almost name calling is more acceptable than picking out specific things you did wrong, which feels like you're attacking my character. It's very strange, because that's not how we feel. But that's one reason why there's so much conflict sometimes in close relationships. There's so much vulnerability, because the autistic person will look at the very particular patterns of things, and the neurotypical person will just look at, like, over time, how do they feel? And when they're drawing conclusions from what the autistic person says, they think that, wow, you felt this way over time. And it's like, no, 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 I just this one time. And it's very difficult to get the two people on the same page, especially when emotions are high.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, I was reading in a segment of your book in relation to the relationships between a neurotypical and an autistic versus an autistic and an autistic, and how actually sometimes two neurodivergent people together, it can actually create more conflict, which I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand, and I think it's a very sensitive area, especially because the spectrum is so vast. And
Yeah.
I do want to touch a bit on this aspect of the spectrum, right? Because there are a lot of myths about autism, the autism spectrum, and I do believe that there just isn't enough curiosity and investigation around it, and just openness. And yeah, like it's, the research started in the 1940s on boys and on the males, and it was very observational, so very overt, into the
Yeah.
symptoms overtly. And I would love to touch, like, to give this dance for the audience as well, on how it's going to look differently for a woman like myself, and also
Hmm.
you being a male. Like, could you explain first, why is the spectrum so vast, and what does it
Yeah.
look like?
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, one reason why it's so vast is just because we're talking about, gosh, just different synaptic wiring. Yeah, I mean, not to get too sciencey with it, but from what we can tell, and there's a lot of, we're still doing tons of research, and there's different conflicting ideas going on, but from what we can tell, on average, an autistic will have 25% more synapses than a non-autistic. So their brains are overwired, and that essentially means they're not filtering out information as much. So between any two autistics, those wirings can be done in so many different ways, that between any two autistics, their brains are most likely more different than it would be from one of those autistics and a neurotypical. And it's just because there's just so much variation in the different ways that they could be. And neurotypicals seem to be very much in the middle of, like, a normal distribution. So the variations, just, it's really vast. And so what really makes autistics alike is being different. Our differences make our experiences alike and make our context more alike. And obviously, we tend to have, within that overwiring, some of us are extra sensitive to, sights or sounds, or pay extra attention to some of those things. And some of us maybe sort of may not develop in some of those areas more. I always like to say that it's like our filters are off, that we aren't filtering out information in the same way that our brains are really, there's so much information around us, and our brains are made to filter out stuff that is unimportant, so we can pay attention to the stuff that's going to keep us alive, right? And which makes sense. And so when your filter is in a different position, you might notice all kinds of different patterns in nature and in people, but it might be really hard for you to see what's important and what's not. And you might not pick up on language as well as you pick up on, different air pressure patterns or smell patterns or different things like that. It's just hard to say. So we all develop very differently. Um, and of course, our environment is going to change that too, because it's genetic, and then it's environmental. So no matter how you're born, the way you're raised is going to change it a lot. And I always think that one reason why I feel like I'm very privileged is my parents raised me very much with, like, you're different, isn't that great? Instead of, like, hide your differences. So I felt like that allowed me to get to know myself and get to know my differences much, much earlier, where some people I'm talking to are just getting to sort of finally not feel ashamed and get to know their differences now. So okay, so differences between men and women, of course, this is the part of that environmental thing too. And of course, speaking at least for this culture, the demographic in the United States who's most allowed to be like themselves is white men. You know, white men are not discriminated against. We have a lot of social power and a lot of economic power, and that's just how it's always been, despite efforts to make things more equal. And women are socialized to pay a lot of attention to what other people's needs are. They're socialized to let other people speak first, to attend to other people, to be caregivers. And all of that socialization basically makes every woman wear more of a mask than a man. You know, I mean, just the phrase that we have, boys will be boys, let's just basically says, well, let's let the boys do what they need to do. And we've always been allowed to sort of run wild in school and everything compared to women. So when you're brought up in this society and the boys are, you know, if we sort of picture like this is, well, just very broadly, this is normal behavior, and autistic boys are unsocialized and they're way over here, that we extra socialize women so they're over here, and they would have to go all the way through the male territory of behaviorisms before they get to much more autistic presentations. So we have this stereotype that lots and lots of autistic women I talked to were tomboys. They got along with the boys better. They did boy games. They liked more physical activity. They didn't like to wear
That's great.
dresses. Yeah, exactly. Like, because, you know, a lot of the ways that we even dress girls is to preclude physical activity. It's hard to go out and run and jump and slide when you're wearing a dress. And so it just very much hampers them into being more docile than the boys are. And basically, I mean, I think that most of us, most boys even, feel like we got along with the girls better than the boys, just because we're not communicating on the same level as the people in our demographic. So if I'm talking to a lot of women and things are, you know, maybe I'm not picking up on the cues or something, they can be like, well, he's a dude, we don't expect him to pick up on cues. And it can be sort of assigned to that sort of difference. So a lot of the girls grew up getting along better with the boys, and that sort of becomes acceptable. Like, oh, well, you know, she's into sports, she's a tomboy. And they miss the fact that they could be autistic because they're just more heavily socialized. They're more heavily controlled. And I mean, and within this country, again, you have a lot of different races who are more heavily socialized too, because they're afraid of what's going to happen if their kids misbehave in certain contexts, and they're taught to mask in certain contexts. So again, there's different levels of socialization so they don't act up and get in trouble, and they can miss that too. So we have this like huge phenomenon of where just overwhelmingly it was white boys that they based autism and ADHD on. And there was this whole myth, I mean, all the way up into the 90s, that girls couldn't be autistic, which is just crazy, especially if the same people who thought that also thought that it comes from, you know, vaccines or aspirin or whatever. I'm sorry, Tylenol or whatever. And it's like, well, how could it possibly just affect the Y chromosome if that's the case? It's but yeah, people just seem to again, this is very top-down thinking. They oversimplify this into being, you know, if it looks this
Yeah.
way, yeah, you know, if it look like, and the whole reason that we should, you know, point out that it's a spectrum is that if somebody says that they're autistic and they don't look like your nephew, that's because it's a spectrum. You know, we need to understand that it's not going to look the same, and we have to sort of accept that. There's a lot of argument going on right now about how, like, we should probably see different sub conditions here or different names for things, and but since it seems to be along the same genetic causes and the same sort of like brain makeup. I mean, I'm not an expert in those things, so it's hard for me to say. I just know that the way that it is, it's right now all considered autism. So you know, the spectrum definitely stands. But yeah, definitely it presents differently in women than men, and that really disadvantages women. It really makes it harder for women to be recognized. And yeah, and once you've sort of proved that you can suffer in silence, you know, oh, well, you've come this far, then you're sort of expected to always suffer in silence. And it's really hard, you know?
And I would like to segue a little bit into that of
Yeah.
the, at least maybe just sharing my journey, because I feel like there would be a lot of resonance since there were so many aspects and angles. I'm also a twin. I grew up
Ooh,
with, yes, and
fun.
I believe she's on the other side. Like, I'm a very empathic, big feeler. The thing is, I feel a lot from a frequency standpoint. And you, before you said, I don't want to get into too much of the science. It's called Science and Soul. And I am going to bring some quantum morphogenetic physics into this, because
Awesome.
I don't know if you are familiar with indigo children. And
Uh huh.
just so, indigo children are there, there's the autistics that are in the indigo children, and there's type 1, type 2, and type 3, and it just depends on how many DNA strands are activated in these individuals. And there's there's a certain resonance and a certain opening of, we can say, bandwidth, where they can tune into specific frequencies, they can tune into specific information that is coming in, that neurotypical people cannot do that, also because they do not have that activated DNA potential there. And there are so many factors that come into play of what affect our field, affect our morphogenetic field, our DNA. And of course, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. There
There
are
you go.
many overlays though. And that's the thing. Like, I have hated is a strong word. There's a tough relationship when people ask you to simplify things, because of course, yes, we have to simplify things, but there are so many things that are very complex, right? And they branch out into different aspects. So the things that affect our frequency, not just autistic people, but anyone, are things like EMFs. There are things like not being under fluorescent bright lights all day and not getting grounding and not having your exposure to sunlight. All of those things will affect your bioenergetic field. But for people who are on the spectrum, they are way more sensitive. They are picking up on things almost like a lighthouse tower, that, or an antenna that's really picking up on information. And it's happening very fast, and they can sense that, not just through it. You mentioned it also in your book about the reticular activation system, and that's our filtering system, and it's processing. Is it like we get 1 billion bits of data per second, but we only process 10
Yeah, it's
bits?
something like that. Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah, I've read something like in any like given setting there might be um 2 million pieces of information, and most people might be processing 200, and an autistic might be processing 1,400 of those. Something, and these are all very back of the envelope ideas, but yeah,
Yeah. Yes.
yeah,
And I mean, if I look at my journey as a young girl, there's been a big grieving process in the last year of since unpacking this. And I'm sure you can relate to the grief that comes with finding out certain things, because you're like, oh shit, okay. And there, for example, as a young girl, I realized how much I masked, because I wanted to copy all the kids at school. I wanted to have the same bag, the same shoes. And there was this fear that if I didn't, I wouldn't belong, because I was already exiled, in a sense, by not growing up with my mother and being taken away from her at 2 months and then 4 months. And when you're not also in close proximity between 0 to 3 years as a newborn with your mother, that has detrimental effects on the brain as well. So
yeah.
this is what I mean. There are a lot of complex factors. My mom was also a heroin addict. She was an alcoholic. There was a lot of that. And there's a lot of aspects of trauma that layered things. My twin and I, we stopped seeing her when we were 4 or 5 years old. And until then, we were living with our grandmother, my father's mom, and my dad. There was a lot of masking required in itself, because I really put this down to just lack of knowledge, lack of
Yeah.
them knowing. But the trait, like when I look back, there are so many traits, traits about not liking certain textures, the fidgeting, but you're told, don't fidget, sit down, don't ask for that, be quiet, and this constant thing. So, in fact, I developed hypothyroid when I was 12 and put on medication for that. And from a spiritual perspective, because I truly believe in these things, the metaphysical, it's the suppression of your voice, your truth, and a lot of internalization. Because I also witnessed my sister getting punished, and like physically, and I remember the pain like I felt inside, and the anger, and I'll just never forget those emotions. But it was all then internalized constantly. And then I feel like the behaviors became like obsessions with little things. So I began to paint. I would obsess over seashells, for example, or like just collecting specific things, or not the trains. Wasn't obsessed with trains. I wasn't
Yeah.
obsessed with, and I think that was the thing as well. Our father, because didn't grow up with an embodied feminine figure, there was a lot around like just being comfortable with the masculine and knowing just certain masculine things too, or being expected to know how to fix something, or know how to do, or carry the things inside, like the doing and not the being. So that created some
Yeah.
disconnect. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, for one thing, that I try to tell people is that when you're masking, you're shrinking your needs. You shrink your needs, and you never really develop your own personality. You develop a mask that really reflects the needs of other people around you, the expectations of other people around you. And yeah, so you hide yourself, and what you're also hiding is all of the potential that you have to really be happy. You're hiding the part of you that needs to come out in order to be happy and autonomous, and to really feel alive. Like, those are the very parts of you that have to be hidden. And it's so sad that we do that to people. I mean, imagine, it's easy to draw some parallels with sexuality just because it's so much more visible, I think, and quick. But if I was forced to mask my attraction to women, how could I live a satisfying life? It would be so impossible for me, because that's such a core part of my being, and such something that I really want out of life. And there's other things like that. I mean, like the things that we get really interested in, the ways we want to spend our time. I mean, just our needs for comfort, our needs for safety. I mean, we have to hide all of that. It's really sad. It really is. And yeah, and doing it for other people's comfort, other people's safety, just like, like you said, like staying still, being quiet, all of that is it's for other people's comfort. And I find that so difficult to do, and we've all quieted a child. We've all had those moments. But when it's a way of life that you tell somebody that they always have to stop this thing that they clearly is something that's in them,
Yeah.
it's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like what I've come to realize now is also, it's like only now am I, since I've accepted and kind of like realized, oh, I actually have built my entire life on thinking that this is how I need to show up, and thinking this is who I
Yeah.
am. But essentially, when they're saying like, oh, if you're really, if you're struggling constantly, then you're going the wrong way. Like, yes, there's supposed to be challenges in life, there's supposed to be obstacles, but if it really always feels like an uphill battle, you are probably going the wrong way.
Right.
Can you take me
Right.
to a part of your life that you felt that you were having to mask? And this is before, maybe before you went into working as a professor, like maybe there are
Hmm.
times before that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, gosh, I am and was a pretty big guy, and I matured pretty quickly for my age, and going into high school, there was a lot of pressure on me to play football, and we're talking American football. And just everybody was always, oh, you're going to play football next year? This was just a question on everybody's mind. And just the way I was built, it looked like it. And I just felt this was an assumed thing. It felt like, it's hard to put it any other way than it felt like I owed everybody, that I had to do this. And maybe it felt like I was going to be popular if I did. So I played football, and I absolutely hated it. I hated it on so many levels. It was exhausting, and the exhausting wasn't the worst part, really. It was the yelling. There was just like this culture of like anger, and this culture of that just didn't speak to me at all. And it was a surprisingly intellectual game, at least for the part that I played in it. There was a lot of stuff that I had to memorize, and I found that, challenging. And then when we would be, doing our drills or doing the game, and I had this coach who would say, "I want to see you get mad, Smith," and I would be like, well, "Why?" I'm like, "I'm doing my part. I'm gonna do my part. It's fine. I'm not good. Like, I'm not angry at anything. We're good. Like if I screw up and you think the anger would have helped me, cool. But it, like, for the most part, I didn't screw up, and the times I did screw up, I'm pretty sure that being mad wouldn't have helped it. I just can't imagine. And just the whole culture was like that, and all the other kids that were like that, and I just, like, it wasn't my thing. It felt so wrong, and so I did it for 2 years, and tried to take some kind of pride in it, but I really didn't. At some point, I hit my head pretty badly and had some dizzy spells, and I told the coach, I said, "Hey, I went to a neurologist, and yeah, I've got some sort of a post-concussive thing where I've got these dizzy spells, and I think I need to stop playing." And he said, "Listen, we'll get you checked up again in a couple months. We can get you a double reinforced helmet." And I said, "I'm 16 years old, and I might have a brain injury, and you want me to come back and play for what, your high school football contract?" I was like, "That's insane. Why wouldn't you be saying, like, oh my God, I'm sorry, are you okay?" Like, you jumped straight to, how can you get me back in the game? Like, I just found it, like, just so mind blowing, and I just, like I couldn't have been happier to walk away from that. And of course, it ended up really being nothing, and I did make more out of the head thing than I had to, because I really wanted this excuse. I felt like I had to have an excuse to stop playing, because everybody wanted this out of me, and it was just such a terrible fit. And then I was ashamed. I was ashamed that I stopped playing. But every single day that we passed by and saw people practicing, every single time there was a football game or whatever, I was just relieved. Just relieved. Yeah, it was just a terrible culture. It just was something I didn't want to be a part of at all. But it really felt like I had to. Yeah.
And this is, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I think it's where I'm not one to associate with labels. I mean, I
Hmm.
relinquished the labels I got with when I was diagnosed with autoimmune, and I definitely don't believe I had those, because it stems from the autism, the neurodivergence, and actually
Yeah.
then the nervous system health, and healing a lot of the trauma. But I chose to honor the label of autism, because it finally gave me a sense of relief, quite literally a huge relief.
Yeah.
And a relief from the expectations that so many put on you to show up in a way, and fail to have the compassion or curiosity or understanding of, I wonder why they don't want
Yeah.
to do this, they don't like this. Or even if I couldn't go to certain events, or I couldn't always say yes. And bear in mind, I feel, and you will resonate with this a lot, because our energy as practitioners, it's outward, it's to be of service, it's showing up, it's holding space, it's okay, how can I add value? And of course, it's still, like, it still has an impact on us, like, there are still moments that we're like, okay, I need to go and really recharge from this. And I just feel that I got so exhausted from all the expectations of needing to operate a certain way and show up in this way, and what success looked like, when it just felt like I was constantly grasping for it and it was never going to reach me. And suddenly, the moment
Yeah.
I just said, you know what, holy shit, like, all of these are, it's actually made me feel like I'm a freaking warrior for the fact that I have continuously persisted through, and for the journey that I'm on, and it is unique to each of us. It is not how it's supposed to look for Daisy down the street, like. And so when you learned to take charge more of your own energy and your own time and sense of self, how did that start to improve your relationship with yourself and others?
Gosh, that's really well said. I think that like the one of the first things that happens is, and this takes a while. It takes a lot of reinforcing to yourself, is that you can start really taking off a lot of shame. And I think that we take on some shame that we feel like we have to have because things have been hard, or we failed at something, or we've given up on something that we felt like we were supposed to do. Even if we wanted to, even if we wanted to give up, even if we wanted to fail, even if we knew it wasn't us, we become ashamed of it. And it's so hard to admit to yourself that you don't have to be ashamed of this, because it feels like that shame is the price you pay. That shame is somehow atonement, that you must feel ashamed so that you're okay. You're an okay person. Otherwise you're terrible if you're not ashamed of this. So I feel like that's really one of the very first things, was just shedding that shame and allowing yourself to shed it. And with that comes a lot of anxiety, just a lot of anxiety coming off. And I mean, that's like, those things by themselves are so hard to do, but it's hard to articulate this, but it's sort of like, when you stop observing yourself that way, when you stop watching how other people see you so much, it's like you reorient yourself more inside yourself, and you become more present. And I think that we really, there's a lot of talk about how we don't, we're not as aware of how we feel. We're not as aware of even our spatial sense. I mean, I do hit my head constantly on things. I do stub my toe. Like, I do have very poor sense of the spatial awareness around me. And I think that a lot of that comes from our separating ourselves from our very bodies, separating ourselves from our sense of self, and trying to see us from the outside like everybody else does. And it's, falling back into yourself, being present in your body, and trying to figure out what you want, trying to get what you want. It's so hard. Like, I found that with so many late identified autistics who I talk to, who are age, 30 and above, but probably even lower, I'll say, so what do you want? And they can probably name things that they want for their kids, if they have kids, things that they want for their partners or their parents, things they want for their friends. But it's so hard for them to say really what they want for them, because that hasn't been the priority. They feel like their worth comes from what they can give to other people. And
uh,
certainly that's great. Like we want to be able to give to other people, but we don't. But when you feel like that's your whole worth, you're actually kind of trying to get something out of that. It doesn't become selfless, because you're expecting something in return. You're expecting this sense of self-worth. You're expecting this sense of self to come from that, and it won't, and you'll just keep chasing that. So I think we do need to know what it is that we want. We need to seek some sort of completion within ourselves, and only then can we really give of ourselves to other people, and give people a better relationship, more authentic relationship of us. And I think that all of that's just very hard for us to understand, because it's because we've been doing it backwards. We've been trying to give other people a relationship with us through their eyes, but we have to do it through who we actually are. And that means, having boundaries. That means doing the things that we want to do, and inviting people to do what we want to do, not just doing what they want to do. It's a very hard thing to understand, that there has to be shared sacrifice and shared time, all of that thing. It's, maybe this is too long of an answer, but it's just
no,
a whole lot. It's a whole lot.
it is, but this is also why I would like to touch on the factors of somatic work, as a someone who did that work before I became a practitioner, it truly saved my life. It changed my body, and it helped me work on a lot of aspects of trauma and wounding that led me into this archetype of the pleaser and the overgiver and giving away my energy. And when you think about it, it's just where your energy flows, your attention goes, and vice versa. So again, if you grow up not having the sense of self and not having the people around you be curious to draw that from within, because I love the word education, which comes from the Latin word educo, which actually means to draw out from within. The
Ooh, I love
education
that.
system, but the education system has been doing it freaking backwards. It's like, oh, let's
Yes.
just dump everything in and completely switch off the innate intelligence. And
Yeah.
this journey has actually shown me that I'm actually coming back to the little girl that I knew all of these things that I'm coming back to now. And I'm like, this is who I was all along. Like, this is crazy. Like 31 years, and I am realizing that I have always been enough, and that my gifts were in my voice and my art and my expression of presence. Because you mentioned something in terms of spatial awareness and those things. It's funny because before I was working a lot on the trauma components and nervous system related, so proprioception, which is where your body feels in space, neuroception, the detection without awareness, that was all jumbled up, we can say. Like it's like a foggy glass, because there's just so much that the body hasn't completed yet, like the completion of procedural memories. But the more I
Yeah.
clean that up in the body and in my field, the the more in tune I became with myself and the louder things became. So I realized actually how shut down I was and dissociated and disembodied I was. And all of a sudden, everything became really loud. So even after my somatic training, I went through the biggest, yeah, that just took me on such a huge journey, and everything continued to get louder. And I was like, am I doing something wrong? Like, am I going backwards? Like, this doesn't make sense. Why is everything becoming essentially hard? It felt like it was becoming harder at first.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the spatial, like I did one of the personality quizzes, and I actually am like in the top 1% apparently who has a certain like spatial orientation around things, because I detect a lot from the field. So, for example, I can detect the energy between me and you, like the space in between us. I can feel that. I feel it almost on an atomic level. It's very strange, but
That's
very
really
cool at the
cool.
same time.
Yeah, that's
Cool,
really
exactly.
cool.
It's like very
Yeah.
cool. So, that's why with the work that I do, I can use my hands and go into that space. But where was I going with this? Damn it.
Well, see, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sorry to interrupt at all, but when there is something like that that is part of, your what you're born with, what your gift is, and we don't see it really modeled in our world. We don't have role models. We don't have it in our education system. Nobody's teaching us this. And instead we're being, kind of pushed towards this other model of being where people are like trying to get us to work harder on the things that we're actually bad at. And even if they see a talent in some things, they're like, well, okay, you're okay with this. Work harder on the bad stuff. It just makes us feel worse and worse about ourselves. And we have all of these innate abilities that we're just ignoring. And how are we supposed to build a life that feels like it has value,
That's the tough part I've been grappling with, to be very honest. Even this past month, it's like the massive realization of I'm tired of doing the things that actually feel forced, and I feel like I had to do because I didn't feel smart enough through, because I felt so much, and that wasn't acceptable. You have to know things. I'm very I'm very left brain in many things, because I love to geek out into the science, but only about specific topics like science, health related, quantum science. Everything else, I just, you can give it to me and I will forget it like 2 seconds later.
Yeah, yeah,
I suck at like learning certain information. Do you find that though?
yeah.
Like that is it also the same like for you that you can only learn specific things and gather specific information?
Yeah, I think that essentially, and this could be part of the ADHD, I'm not sure. Kids used to say to me, and I'm thinking like especially college, they'd say, "Is that class hard?" And to me, there was no hard or easy class. It was interesting or boring. If I was interested in it, it felt like it just worked. And if I wasn't interested, just nothing stuck. Nothing was there for me, you know? But yeah, like, I mean, some things were really hard for me. Like numbers don't really stick. I'll remember like sort of magnitudes of numbers. Like I'll be able to say something like, oh, there's more neurons in your brain than there are grains of sand in the world. But I can't remember, what is this, like 410 quadrillion, or is it like, 59 billion? I have like whatever that statistic was, it'll just go away. But I remember that there's a concept there that's very cool. So like I'm much more concept oriented than I am oriented on specifics. But it definitely, if I'm interested in something, I don't generally have a problem at least learning the concepts. But if I'm uninterested, it's just like I just won't even be present for it, and that's made it really hard. And that's honestly like, I wish that I cared more about math when I was younger, because I think that now that I could have been okay at it. But in my classes, it was all very abstract. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I would ask questions. I would be like, but why are we doing it this way? And I really meant it. I really wanted to see what this equation did, not just how to solve it, how to solve this problem because it was on the homework. I was looking for context so that it would make sense, because then I feel like I could have understood it. But the teacher always felt like I was questioning them, like I was saying, like, when are we going to use this in real life? And it wasn't like that. I wanted to know, like, where it came from, who invented this. Because like, if I talked to my dad about it, my dad was brilliant, and like, he liked math, but he always jumped into the stories. He would tell us how Newton invented calculus, and like he would explain this little story about it and stuff, and it made it sound really exciting. And I just felt like, why aren't we learning it that way? Why aren't we,
Yes.
like, why isn't this being
Yes.
brought into our world instead of just being these numbers that are just hanging out somewhere? And I understand, like, math teachers are really good at math, and they didn't feel like you needed all of that. That's not how they thought, and they had a job to do. So it's just all very fragmented and separate, and it's not how we think at all. We think in connections.
I love that you brought this up, because there's also this kind of thing where there are certain autistics who are great at numbers. But for
Hmm.
example, I just like you, the same thing with maths. And I remember my math teacher telling me, "You are not gonna pass, Tara." And I was like, I will pass. I got 68%. And
Yeah.
but it was absolutely terrible. These are fireworks, by the way, in the background.
Wow.
They're not nothing going on. I was terrible at math because I felt that my brain works. If you explain why, it's like all of a sudden there's this switch and I get it. But if I don't understand why, I just can't get it. And my dad used to tell me all the
Yeah.
time, like, you never stopped asking why. The only thing is,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I relate to this concept, this thing of conceptualizing. I can gather the concepts, and I feel like sometimes people rely too much on certain details. Of course, certain statistics are important and we need certain quantifiable things, but I really believe that there's so much more to life and what's going to actually help us improve our day-to-day lives. No one's I'm going to go for a walk today because 98% of people who walk have a greater longevity and no one's going to come and just say that to you. They're just going to
Right.
say it improves my health,
Right.
like the
Right.
so I
It's
just
good for
feel,
me. Yeah.
yes, exactly. So this is why even this podcast in itself like is called Science and Soul, because of course, yes, there's the aspects of science which are extremely important, and it's what has helped me and you for sure understand ourselves and others better and the world and how everything operates. But there's a lot that is more right-brained, more feeling, sensing, knowing.
Yeah.
And can you touch a little bit on, because our peripheral nervous system is constantly, gathering that information, our sensory organs, our skin,
Hmm.
everything at such a rate that sounds, smells, everything, whether it's specific lights, they are all being processed by the body. How does it differ in the neocortex of the neurotypical versus the autistics?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely different and of course it'll be different for different autistics, but in general, from what we can tell, an autistic's brain is made to detect patterns in those things. It's made to be more aware of all of those little inputs. And that can be really overwhelming because it's a lot of information to be aware of, but especially if, you know, you're expected to be, I mean, if you're aware of all of that, but you're also expected to be aware of what all the neurotypicals are aware of, you know, and it's sort of like, I don't know, it's maybe this is a silly way of looking at it, but if we think of, and a lot of us like to play armchair evolutionary psychologist, but there's probably something to it that if we think of ourselves like, some sort of a band of people evolving over time in these groups, and almost like D&D characters, you're going to have characters who have different strengths and different weaknesses that help the whole group survive. And it makes sense that they would have different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think that the neurotypical point of view is so limited that they see strengths and weaknesses as like, maybe a globe over here, and instead it's like a much larger globe. And they don't see that there should be other strengths out here, and we don't need to all be paying attention to the same small group of inputs. And is this a post-industrial revolution thing? Is this come from the whole notion of data and productivity and moving money up the system? That's sort of my theory. But I think that we weren't all meant to be so similar. I think that we shouldn't have such similar strengths and talents. But yeah, so we're aware of a lot more inputs. And so it feels unrealistic that we should also be aware of everything else that they're taught, because it's overwhelming. And I think that that's part of the reason why we do have meltdowns, why we do have shutdowns, why we have trouble regulating ourselves, why we don't want to leave the house, because it's just way too much that we're expected to juggle at once. And it's hard. It's a really hard life, because there's, the accommodations that we can get, say in school, is okay, you can have extra time for the test, but it's not, well, you don't have to take math this semester because this is going to be a lot for you. That like there's not, they won't shut out things at all, or they won't be like, well, you don't have to ride the bus, we'll have somebody pick you up because the bus ride's overwhelming to you. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into this that can just be overwhelming. And it's usually not the place and time where you have trouble. It's all of the other times where you're already being filled up, and then you have this touch point where it's just too much. So yeah, getting extra time on a test doesn't really help us.
It's also ostracizing. I mean, at the end of the day, like, how about you look for other ways that you can expand the mold instead of forcing people to just fit the mold or get out of it? You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Right, yeah, exactly. Like, how else can we, I mean, how else can we define human life? It's just it's so strange to me. I mean, even when you see people arguing about what gender is, and I just wonder, like, why would we think that any one of us is an authority on that? And if you were an authority and somebody else said, no, 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 I'm a different gender, why would you care? I don't understand why we can't let people define the way they want to exist. And I know that that's a very autistic way of seeing things, but I feel like we want to be able to participate from the place where we are. And there's comfort for people if people are more similar. And part of that is biological, and that's scary to me, that we can't overcome that biological drive. I think that's the kind of thing we should be taught in school, is like, hey, we have this biological drive to be more partial to people who look and act like us, and we need to stop it because now we're a global community and we know better.
Do you really think it's biological alone though? Like,
I
because you
don't
mentioned
know.
this,
Yeah.
because
The
I also,
socialization.
like, we are the ones who challenge the status quo and don't abide by certain systems where there is a hierarchy and there is a system that's looking for the flock of sheep, and You know what, that I gave this in a talk recently of just how entrainment works in the quantum physics perspective and the entanglement and then entrainment in neuroscience. So the thing is, like, what are we entraining to? Like, if you see a herd, a flock of birds, you see also like a shoal of fish, there's a pull that's coming from the strongest resonance, the strongest energetic wave, we can say, that's pulling everything into one direction. So what are we in training to? And I feel that this is the funny thing, when I see myself, the younger version of myself, I was literally in training myself to everything outside of who I was. So just making sure that I could fit in. So copying whatever I could, even in simple things like clothes to wear. And I would look at the people I admired and constantly looking at specific movies over and over again, and just seeing, okay, this is what I need to adopt now, and just realizing like, okay, that's not me. And it's only in, I would say, in the last 3 years that I actually have truly peeled the layers to come back home to myself. So are
That's a
we the, sorry to interrupt you,
no. Go ahead.
it's just, is the neurotypical, why is the neurotypical considered as normal, and what is normal?
No, that's a really good point. I mean, normal is just what people agree on, of course. And I guess the neurotypical is just considered average. I always think about, a bell curve, and that, one standard deviation captures 67% of people. So it's easy to say, well, that's normal. And then two standard deviations is 97%. That's pretty normal. And autistics are going to be that other tiny, tiny percentage. So it's easy to be othered that way. But like you said about how you would watch and try to model your behavior off of things and memorize scripts and stuff, there was that psychological experiment that they did in the 70s, but they've repeated it since then, where they watch the brain activity of somebody who has been set up to be asked a question among a group of people, and they answer the question correctly, but the rest of the group disagrees with them, and they see that their amygdala lights up as if there's a huge threat, as if they're now in danger because they don't agree with the group. And that could be a social thing, that could be socially learned, that we need to be in step with the group. And what's funny is I think that an autistic can feel threatened by not being in step with the group, but is less likely to be
100%.
threatened. Yeah, is less likely to be threatened if it is, say, a trivia question, like in that experiment. If it's a question of some knowledge or something, they will stand up against it. But that's exactly where they should be threatened in a workplace. Because
Because it's factual, you mean, right? Because they're
yes, and
factual.
yeah, but the factual thing is they don't want to be told, like a workplace does not want to be told that they're factually wrong. They want to be told that they're right because they want the authority to make them right. And so it's all very backwards that way, and it's all like all of that is very scary to be one of us, because how do we see all of that? Like how are we supposed to take that? Yeah, it's a lot.
Another aspect is how I struggled in terms of working or really finding meaningful work. I would look at jobs before and like say, there's no way that I could work in this, or like I can't do that, I won't do that. And it's funny because you just feel like you don't belong in a sector. Let's say whether it's real estate or it's iGaming, like there are certain types of careers here in Malta that are more limiting than in the States or other parts of the world for that matter. And I am more of an artistic person connected with the body. So if it's outside of that, I cannot find interest. So which means I don't want to show up. I can't. I don't feel I can do it. I just feel that any form of exerted effort should come from some drive within ourselves, no, that wants to pour that energy into it. And isn't
Yeah.
that the way we're best of service? So that's been a really big struggle. I worked at a bank I for 3 years. I went into the fitness world and I competed, and I again very shut down, very stoic, very, I pushed from pain until
Mm.
adrenaline couldn't help me anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But then I look at my twin, who's been in the same financial institution for, I think, 11 years. She has a very repetitive, like, she needs routine. She's very off, like very different, and she needs her specific kind of routine. I admire what she has managed to create for herself in some ways, which I feel like I haven't done because I just can't fit in a norm. Like I just can't do it. Like, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
There's just,
Yeah. Yeah.
how did you find your path? Did you how did you know that you this was what you were meant to be doing and going all in?
Well, I mean, I did always feel, drawn towards, like I said, drawn towards the teaching route of some kind. And it's almost like I felt like there should be something like life coaching that existed, and without really knowing it. And it also wasn't quite therapy that I was looking to do, and I knew that too. But it's funny because I had so much trouble with employers that I kept trying to picture a different way of doing things, a different way, like being an independent contractor as a teacher, and that people could come to me and I could teach them and they could transfer their credits in or whatever. And of course, that no model like that exists, and it felt silly to keep thinking about it. But as I kept sort of looking at things and I kept kind of imagining maybe becoming a therapist, I started researching that, and seeing how my one problem with being a therapist was that there was a certain dogma to the different therapies that you would have to offer that didn't seem constructive necessarily to every situation to me. That they also, in studying to be a therapist, you didn't really study psychology. You studied counseling, you studied talking, you studied, resources and stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it wasn't really the way my brain worked. I wanted to talk about, brains and framing and things like that. So it's funny because I would just be struggling in a job, and I would drive by a little office park that had an office for rent. And I would sit there and think, what could I do in that little office by myself that could make my living? And it's like I was envisioning something like this. So when I started really, really diving into the psychology stuff, and I was just info dumping on my kids and about all this autism, I was trying to explain how, like, hey, get this, guys, we're autistic and we need to talk about this. They kept saying, Dad, just put this on, TikTok, just put it on TikTok. And I was like, nobody wants me on TikTok. I'm an old man. And so I finally did. I told them I was going to give it 1 month. I said, I'm going to do 1 month on TikTok. By then I had my life coaching practice up on a website, and um, it, I had a few clients, but not many. And it was just kind of a side thing. And my idea was that I wanted it to take place of my part-time teaching jobs, because grading was just, I had a full-time teaching and then two other colleges where I taught part-time. It was just too much. And so I had that up, and I told them I would do a TikTok video every day for a month. And I said, if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else. So I did it. And by the end of that month, I was making more money from life coaching than teaching. And it's never gone back. I feel like I got very lucky. The word got out, and what I had to say really, really worked. I was afraid, of course, that I'd say something and I'd be canceled right away, that there would be something that I said that was just wrong or out of step with people. And I would feel, silly just because I had that imposter syndrome thing going on. But I just, put myself out there and said, listen, this is how I've experienced meltdowns, and explained my experience of meltdowns. And then I would say, this is how I've experienced workplace bullying. And I just went through these different things and had all these people say, oh my gosh, I feel so seen. And it made me feel seen. I just never had people relate to my problems before. And it just, like, every day felt like a new discovery of, um, myself, of like, wow, this is really a thing, and I've never really found my people. And now we have a sort of common language. And then I look back at some friends that I've had growing up and stuff, and of course, they were autistic. This is why we related to each other, but we didn't have this common language, and now we do. And it gave us this whole new way of speaking with each other. And it was just, it was just an immense discovery.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And before you became a dad, so like did you have a fear around having?
No, I always wanted to. Like, I was just always excited about it. Um, which I honestly, um, I honestly probably should have had more of a fear about it. But I had a really good role model in my dad, and I just thought I could be like him. And I'm not quite like him. He had a much more expansive bandwidth, I think, than I do, and maybe maybe a tougher childhood, and maybe that's part of what made him a better dad. I don't know, but I do always fall back on what would my dad do here? What would my dad say here? And that's helped a lot. But the first night that I was holding my first kid, and anyone who's had a kid will have this experience that is absolutely shocking. That the way you're wired when you're looking at your first kid, as you know, as long as I know a lot of moms experience some very unfortunate situations with postpartum depression, and my wife did have that with a couple of kids, which is very hard and scary. But typically you're wired to just be so impressed by this baby, you know, and in a way that you've never have been before. And so I'm looking at this baby and thinking, like, I have never seen anything so perfect in my life. And I think everybody should feel this about any baby, of course. And I'm like, you can't make anything perfect better. So I can only fuck this up. And this sort of reality hit me that, like, I as good as I could possibly be, I cannot make this better or even to its full potential, because there's this whole world out here and everything, and I can't be perfect. And I just decided that, like, I'm just going to fuck it up as gently as I possibly can. You know, I'm just going to try to stay out of the way. And yeah, it was great. It was it's been like, they're just my favorite people. They're just wonderful, and of course we have some really hard times, and but it's been it's just been the best part of my life, really. And they're all autistic and they're all fun. So
What did you mean by stay out of the way?
I mean, like, I think that so many people see their kid as like they want to mold them into something, and I think that you
That's
have
true.
to let them tell you. Yeah, I think that you have to let them tell you who they are, and then you have to, like, help them be that. My third kid was very, very socially anxious, especially after COVID. Very, very shy, scared to leave the house and everything, but she was obsessed with solving Rubik's cubes. She saw a documentary about speed cubing competitions, and there were these two kids that were competing for world champion in it, and they formed this really great bond. It's very inspiring. One of them is very profoundly autistic, and the other one is much less obviously autistic. And it's a very heartwarming documentary. And after she saw this, she said, "My goal is to meet these two." And I was like, "Okay, go for it." And she worked and worked on this, and 6 or 8 months later she was going up against them. Like, she got very good at this.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, like, we went to world championships this year, and I mean, she's I want to say that for a couple events she's like number 70 or so in the United States. So she's gotten
That's
pretty good.
amazing.
Yeah. And the thing is that, like, she works so hard at it. She works hours every day. She'll do sometimes 300 solves a day, and she keeps all the data about what she does, um and then she does her homework. And her whole thing is that she thinks that the work she's done on her cube has taught her how to learn better and how to concentrate better. And she might be right. She has her grade point average is the highest in the district. um she's going to have her choice of colleges to go to, and she says it's all because of the cubing. And the thing is I feel like, and I'm not even saying this is to my credit. My credit was to be out of the way. That I think that the typical thing would be, you can't do your cubing until you finish your homework. And I think that wouldn't have worked for her. I think she would
Oh my
have,
God.
yeah, I think she would have done a bad job at both of them. But I think
I
that letting
love.
her really, yeah, I think letting her really dig into what she was fascinated with gave her so much more momentum. And she also formed community with all these people she meets at the competitions. And she's just out of her shell. And just all of these kids, the first time they come to the competition, they sit with their parents and they're quiet. And I sit and talk with the parents. And by their third or fourth competition, those kids are mingling and talking. And it's just all of them. I mean, a vast majority of them are neurodivergent. It just, there's something about that pattern that really speaks to them. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful community. I wish that I had it when I was little. I can solve one, but it takes me like a minute, and it takes her 6 seconds. So it's
That's
no competition.
impressive. That's impressive. Also, I love that you said that. I absolutely love it
Thank
because
you.
thank you for sharing that, and I truly believe that
Yeah.
whoever listened to it will feel that, because yeah, I definitely grew up in that way of, yeah, like it's just study. And I've painted ever since I was a child, and wrote poetry and lyrics and produced music, and but it was, oh no, you
Yeah.
put that away and focus on what's important. And you're absolutely right, because now I'm coming back to it. Now, 31 years later, this is what I want to embed in my life. And it's so beautiful that you just, what you mean by get out of the way is allow them to unfold in the way that they're meant to unfold. You're not meant to interfere with that. You're only meant to support it. And I truly believe that children hold so much knowledge and wisdom, and there's so much that flows through them if you allow it, not just, oh, you're such a, you're a child, what do you know? No, not at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not at all.
Exactly. And I try to take an interest in at least a few things that every one of my kids is interested in, to let them see that I'm taking, I want them to see that I take them seriously. I take their interest seriously, and we will go out of the way to let them chase that interest, because it's I think that's so important. I saw kids who were forced into sports, and I wasn't forced into sports by my parents, but I felt like I was by my peers. And I just, like, I see kids were forced into different things, and tried to push into these different shapes. And I think that it's just so sad. But yeah, I do think they need to see that we take them seriously, and that we take their interests seriously, because I remember what it was like to be a kid. And I feel like I was myself at age 4, you know? And it would be so sad for me to feel like I was talked down to, but I never felt like I was talked down to, you know?
When I reflect on my journey, there's just so much grief there. It's pretty
Yeah.
crazy. But
Yeah. No, I understand. I understand. And again, I feel like this is, you know, I think this is why I am where I am. And it's very lucky that my environment led me to a place where I could, you know, write a book, do these lectures and stuff that hopefully can help people who didn't have that environment have a shortcut, you know?
yes, and in terms, like, just to kind of touch on this topic as well before we close off, because I think it's very relevant. And your wife is ADHD, so you talk about that in the
Yes, she
book
is.
as well. And there is this cross intersection with, or overlap, we could say, with ADHD, with certain aspects of trauma. But then again, there are significant differences. So could you speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's the crossovers with ADHD and autism are really interesting. I feel like sometimes when you can't, I think a lot of the crossovers have to do with executive function, right? That we both seem to lack a lot of the outward control that neurotypicals have over what they're going to be interested in and what they're going to pay attention to. And it may or may not be for some of the same reasons. It's hard for us to say. But ADHDers have, very high powered brains, very fast thinking, and they have very big emotions. And that's something I think we don't talk about enough, is that on brain scans, all of their emotions are more extreme than we would typically expect. I mean, like, their frustrations are bigger, but their joys are bigger too. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that probably that when we're socialized with very tight executive function, that you're taught to control your emotions very well. And again, I think that's a little sad. But it's frustrating for people because they think that they can't pay attention, but the thing is they just cannot have their attention directed from the outside. They have to pay attention to things that interest them, and otherwise there's going to be procrastination, there's going to be stress, and they can get the job done, but stress is never as productive as dopamine, and it's certainly not as productive when it comes to rewiring your brain. So they don't do things like form good habits and stuff, because it takes dopamine to really move your synapses around to build these automatic processes. So they do very much have what ends up being a social disability, where if we let their school be something more free, where they could follow their interests and follow connections, over time they would likely get enough of all of those subjects in. But instead we expect there to be everything's by the clock, everything's regimented, and it just doesn't speak to the ADHD mind at all. So in some ways that a lot of that's like autism, but they tend to not have the same communication issues. They tend to be a little bit more socially adept. They will be socially excluded lots of times because of the way they will jump from subject to subject, and the way that, the hyperactivity part is really in their brain, the way that they will look at connections and things. And sometimes that turns people off. So they burn very brightly, and some people just can't take that, you know?
I do feel that because I've observed over the years, there are elements of the ADHD in certain things that I do,
Mm-hmm.
but,
Mm-hmm.
and I see this in other neurodivergence too, but there's a lot that shifted again through certain trauma work and nervous system work and being able to sit, because of course then there's the aspect of where people cannot sit with themselves, sit with the emotions that are coming up. So this is
Mm-hmm.
why I just truly believe that we all need to do a certain level of this deeper work, and we all need to address
Yeah.
certain things just to clean up, and
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And it's hard because, an ADHDer can be really smart and really interested in something, but not able to push themselves through all of the steps to get a degree. And they have so much rejection from parents and friends and things. Yeah, they do need to do a lot of work to try and, like, again, get rid of that shame and get rid of the feeling of helplessness, and understand that, like, they can have a really great life. They just kind of, like, you have to redefine what your life is going to be like. It's just not going to be that narrow neurotypical life. It's going to be something different, and the way the world's built isn't really for us. But it doesn't mean that we can't, live and play here.
so what is one thing that you wish you could start to see as a change in our society?
I mean, I wish that the stigma would go away. I wish that people would stop seeing there being, just one way of thinking. And I mean, that's a whole big topic. But yeah, I think that people kind of see this sort of one way of thinking, and they write a lot else off as weird. I was called all the time, "You're weird." And I wore that as a badge of honor, but really it's a sort of cognitive roadblock for people, where they want to stop considering your point of view. They want to stop stepping sandbox that you're trying to open up, and they just go, "You're weird," and they go back to this sort of, like, very linear way of
Yes.
thinking. And I think that's really sad. I think that we ought to be allowed to. I mean, lots of times in my classes, we have lots of big class discussions, and at some point somebody will say, "God, we're way off topic," and I'll be like, "No, there is no off topic." There really isn't. Then we'll trace the connections. I'll say, "Here's how we got here," and we walk it back, because
I
I
love it.
firmly believe that we need to see all of those connections. That we have this great big constellation of stuff that is all interconnected, and when we fragment it apart, it loses its meaning. But you can get the questions right, and I think that's what people are thinking. They need to get questions right.
Yes, and I really do feel like there's the paradox of like the 4 minute mile where yes, when you see someone else do something, it gets you to go ahead and to push,
Yes.
and but then it also is that's paradox of okay, but how about you try another route, try something else, try aim for another time. Why are you trying to copy a template instead of and just aim for one thing instead of, as you said, like looking at the holistic and that entire constellation? But from a female perspective, what I feel I've noticed, whereas you mentioned this labeling of weird, and I feel that towards men, there are certain labels that are directed towards men, and then towards women, there's a lot of deflection, there's a lot of gaslighting. Um,
Yeah.
and it's again, it's creates this shrinking or the suppression and or being completely misunderstood. I have been called very interesting things or something very simple. As an example, when I get very overstimulated or I'm picking up too much, and let's say I'm in my luteal phase of my cycle, so my body's more
Hmm.
sensitive, I'm just picking up and processing more information. But for me, it affects my vision a lot, and this has happened for many, many years. I went through different specialists to then realize that it was actually coming from the nervous system neurodivergent
Yeah.
aspect. but it affects your entire vestibular system. Your cranial nerves are also highly affected, specific cranial nerves, even when you're more sensitive as a person. But I remember I was in a space, in a sharing space, which was what's supposed to be a spiritual open space. And I remember like not being able to read something on the cards, plus the lights were super dim. And I just said, hey, like, you know what's funny? It's the first time I'm coming out of the house like in a while and I'm connecting with people. And it's so funny because I actually need to ask for help. I can't read this right now. And I didn't go into the explanation. I just said, I can't read this. Can somebody read it for me? And the person who was leading the space eventually came to tell me, I saw that as a call for attention. And I was like,
Oh my
are you
gosh. Yeah.
are you shitting me? Like, you're number one, you're supposed to be a space holder. Let's throw
Yeah.
that out the window. And secondly, it's so interesting that people would assign certain things. And again, it's boiling it down to lack of knowledge, lack of curiosity and compassion. So and I've actually made peace with the fact that you're going to be misunderstood. You're either going to be misunderstood because you're not when you don't share the experiences you're going through, or
Hmm.
you're just going to be misunderstood because you're different. And I prefer to just own the
Right.
fact that I'm different. Like, we can own the fact that we're different. We operate differently. We see the world through a different lens, and we've experienced it through a different lens, through a different
Yeah.
experience. So yeah, like, I'd rather
Yeah.
be misunderstood for that than be misunderstood because I'm afraid to share my truth and I'm afraid to share that I'm different. And then it's like people try to read your sentence, but you left out some pieces, some words. I'd rather give you the metaphor, the full sentence, and it's on you whether you get me or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and I just
Yeah.
think when people don't, when people don't understand you, and you just get written off that way instead of getting to be yourself and letting that have its own value. And we see people break through that way when they're the right place and the right time. You get a
Yeah.
Mozart, right? But I think that even in our own small ways, that we ought to be able to feel that value and feel treasured, at least by the people in our worlds. And I guess really, everybody deserves a better sense of community.
So with that said, and just to close off, Soul, if this was your last message that people would see, what is the message that you want to leave?
Wow, I would say that there's nothing wrong with you, that you have not let the world down, that the world has let you down, and but you don't have to give up, that you can find yourself and make the world work for you at the same time. It's not easy and it's not expected of you, but that we can do this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And the fact that there's the communities and these spaces and us getting together and raising this awareness and bringing
Yeah.
it to the forefront even more, that's so important. And I know that a lot is arising now around these conversations, which I believe should be had. So I'm extremely grateful that you made the time out of your morning to connect today. Thank you so much. It's been a
Thank you very
pleasure.
much. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, for all of you listening, I will link all of Professor Smith's socials and his book on Amazon as well. It's The Autistic Guide to Self-Discovery. And you can also find him on Instagram, the Neurospicy community. It's spicy indeed. There's a lot of insight, tools, information. So yeah, just know that you're not alone and we are here to guide you along this unraveling. So thank
Awesome.
you. Have a
Awesome.
beautiful rest of your day.
And I'll see you in the community.
I just stopped